And sometimes too, to keep in mind, it's with women, it's kind of like it's a lot of sort of opposing angles and opposing shapes. Like if somebody's like standing there, you know, with their hips cocked, you sort of shift the shoulders the opposite way. It's a lot of this kind of stuff. Yeah, so you want to kind of keep that counterbalance kind of in mind. And also, I tend to always try to think if I'm drawing a woman, like what is the overall flow? What is the shape? I tend to kind of think of this sort of shape in mind. So if I was to start a figure here, I'll try to keep it, let's see, in the span of the screen there. Sometimes drawing smaller helps too. I always start off my work with sort of thumbnails about this size. I used to do them about like half the size of the regular page, but I found I was just putting too much work into a piece that ultimately was not going to be the final drawing. So by having my thumbnails this small, I'm able to. It's a lot less intimidating to work on a space this big than a space this big. Because even as long as I've been doing this, this is still intimidating to me. That's a lot of space to fill up. And if you have a little square like this, suddenly it's easier to go like, oh yeah, I can imagine how the figures would look, and to keep the proportions all correct, it's much easier to do it at that size. So that's always something to keep in mind. So let's see here. And I'll explain what I'm doing here in just a second. Okay, this is a pretty typical kind of, it's kind of rough, but that's like a typical kind of maybe comic book pose. You've got the kind of opposing directions kind of here. Here's the hips kind of jutting out that way because the weight is all on this leg, and then this leg is relaxing. Kind of the body's weight is shifting because this leg is not supporting it quite as much. And then to sort of get that what looks correct to the eye, the weight shifts up here. Now that's a pretty basic sort of like. I also tend to think of the woman's shape as sort of like that kind of hourglass. Obviously it's a little thicker up here, gets thin in the middle, kind of gets a little thicker in the hips area again. And the rib cage kind of something, sort of a good rule of thumb is I tend to divide up into thirds. So I'll, here's the top, middle, lower part. And then this gives you your area if you're going to do like, the breasts and all that kind of stuff. It kind of stays in this area right in here. Because you don't want them up here. That looks ridiculous. And obviously, we really don't want them down here. So that's just sort of and the only reason I point that out is because I think it took me a little while to sort of get to the point that to leave this area here sort of, they don't really need to be way up there. Now, as far as creating a figure in space, like I said, this is pretty straightforward. But I find to sometimes get your figure a lot more dynamics, it's good to have a balance of sort of foreshortening and non-foreshortening shapes. So a good example might be if this was like Power Girl or somebody who's flying, I might draw this leg. By the way, that's another sort of little tip. Now I'm kind of crashing through a lot of this information, but the leg kind of flares up there for the thigh, and then in the back, it tends to flare out in the back part. So, that's a good sort of just general rule of thumb that you get your curve in the front part of the leg here, and in the back part with the calf, and this tends to be a little straight, and this tends to be pretty straight. That's a sort of an oversimplification, but something to keep in mind. So if she's like flying here, maybe she'll have her fist out at the viewer, and I'll even sort of cheat it so her fist is, and the fist is a box here just to indicate that it's coming up at the viewer. And then maybe I'll jet her. Very, very few times does somebody completely lock their fist. You tend to see a little bit of the elbow jetting out to kind of give a sense of, that it's not just a fist floating in midair. Or maybe the leg here could like fold in on itself so you got a knee here. And then we got the foot tucking back into itself, and then the, Now I would tend normally not to foreshorten too shoulders.
It's better like that.
Is it? Oh, good. I would tend not to typically foreshorten two limbs on the same side, but I think just in general, like I said, if you can have a straight limb and something that's foreshortened, it does give your figure something more interesting going on, so that there's, you know, sometimes I think that solves the problem a little bit, that general theory of how you make something look like it's really in space by having a mixture of extended limbs with, because if every limb's foreshortened like that, she starts to look like a dwarf. And then if every limb is extended, that's good too, but it's not so much that it's too stiff, it starts to just look really flat, and you want to break up those shapes. So let's see, what were some of the other questions that we had? Came back.